It was the sort of day that seemed almost too perfect for anything unpleasant to occur. The sky above St. Mary Mead was a pale, generous blue, with the faintest touch of summer haze lingering over the village green. The annual garden party at Colonel and Mrs. Bantry's house had drawn nearly everyone from the village, from the cheerful ladies of the Women's Institute to the newly arrived lodgers at the old rectory. Before we begin tonight's mystery, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far our stories travel, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because we bring you new classic mysteries every day, each one full of secrets, suspense, and the brilliance of Miss Marple herself. Stay tuned till the very end, because in this story, every tiny clue matters. There were tables laid with scones and raspberry jam, the clink of teacups and the gentle buzz of conversation. The string quartet from Much Benham played under a striped tent, their music blending with the lazy drone of bees and the occasional bark of a dog. Everything was perfectly ordinary, perfectly civilized. Miss Jane Marple sat near the rose trellis knitting something of indeterminate shape and color, as was her way. Her keen blue eyes, however, missed nothing. Though her hands moved steadily with the needles, her mind was elsewhere, observing Mrs. Price Ridley's nervous glances, Miss Hartnell's pinched disapproval of the vicar's new wife, and young Dr. Leonard Hurst's rather attentive gaze toward a certain widow in lavender. Funny thing, human nature, Miss Marple murmured half to herself, half to her companion, the Reverend Clement's wife, Griselda, who laughed and said she'd rather not know what her neighbors were capable of. It was then that a curious hush fell across the lawn. The music stopped abruptly. A footman, pale and trembling, stumbled out from the side of the house. "Mrs. Bantry," he cried, voice cracking. There's someone in the library." Mrs. Bantry, ever dramatic, rose at once. "In the library? Who?" The footman swallowed. It's a lady, madam. She's quite dead." The words rippled through the crowd like a chill breeze. Teacups froze midair. People exchanged frightened, fascinated looks. Dead in the Bantry's library? Colonel Bantry, red-faced and blustering, barked orders to clear the area and fetch the constable. But the gossip had already begun in earnest. By the time Inspector Craddock from Much Benham arrived, the garden party had turned into something of a morbid village fete. Clusters of villagers whispered in twos and threes, exchanging theories as easily as they had earlier shared gossip about the vicarage's new curtains. An outsider, surely, insisted Mrs. Price Ridley. One of those commercial travelers, no doubt. "Nonsense," said Miss Hartnell. "I'd wager it's something domestic. You can't tell with these well-to-do families." "It might be someone Mrs. Bantry knew," suggested Griselda rather more quietly. "A friend, perhaps?" Miss Marple said nothing. She simply sat, knitting still in her lap, her eyes distant and thoughtful. Inside the house, the atmosphere was different, still heavy and oddly intimate. The body of a young woman lay sprawled on the hearthrug, her fair hair disordered, her dress torn slightly at the shoulder. She was quite beautiful even in death. On the table beside her, a silver cigarette case gleamed faintly in the dim light. Inspector Craddock stood beside Colonel Bantry, notebook in hand. "No one recognizes her?" "Never seen her before in my life," said the colonel gruffly. "Nor has my wife, though she's in a dreadful state about it." Miss Marple entered quietly as though she had simply wandered in by mistake. "I do beg your pardon, Colonel," she said gently. "I thought perhaps Mrs. Bantry might need some company." Craddock frowned. "This is a police matter, Miss Marple." "Yes, of course," she said, smiling kindly. "But I've always found it helps to have someone about who understands how people behave when dreadful things happen. One sees such little things." Craddock hesitated. He had learned enough about Miss Marple to know that her little things often proved inconveniently significant. When Mrs. Bantry was brought in, pale, trembling and indignant, Miss Marple helped her to a chair. "It's dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "In my library, of all places. What will people think?" "Oh, people will think what they always do, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, her eyes flicking toward the body. "They will think the worst." Mrs. Bantry gave a watery laugh. "And you, Jane, what do you think?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her knitting. "I think, my dear Dolly," she said softly, "that the poor young woman did not die where she lies." There was a silence. Inspector Craddock looked up sharply. "What makes you say that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, merely an observation," she said lightly. "One learns in life to notice when things are out of place. The books, for instance. See how they've been disturbed on the lower shelves? And the rug shifted as though dragged." Craddock followed her gaze, frowning. "You think she was brought here?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think," she said, "that someone wished her to be found here, and not elsewhere." Outside, the gossip swelled. A body in the library. Fancy that. Who could she be? Why the Bantry's library of all places? And through it all, Miss Marple remained calm, her mind turning over the small details that others dismissed. The faint scent of gardenia perfume, a smudge of mud on the girl's heel, and the curious way Mrs. Price Ridley had turned away when the footman first announced the discovery. A dead girl in a library. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that murder was never about where, but why. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she thought quietly, someone already knew the answer. By the next morning, St. Mary Mead was humming with excitement. That peculiar kind of excitement only a proper scandal can bring to a quiet English village. News of the dead girl in the Bantry's library had spread like spilled ink, soaking into every teacup conversation, every shop counter exchange, every whispered remark exchanged over garden fences. At the post office, Miss Weatherby declared that she'd always said there was something odd about the Bantrys. All that talk about the Colonel's time in India and his stories about tiger hunts. One wonders what else he's brought home. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley whispered darkly that she had seen a strange young woman in the lane 2 days before. Painted up like a chorus girl, she was. The sort that leads men into trouble. And at the vicarage, Griselda Clement, ever candid, told her husband that half the village was secretly delighted. "You know how they are, Len. They've been waiting years for something interesting to happen." The Reverend sighed and shook his head. "It's a dreadful business, Griselda. Poor Bantry, to have this on his hands." Griselda stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Do you think he did it?" "My dear, certainly not." "Oh, don't look so shocked," she said lightly. "I don't think so either. But it's what everyone's wondering." Meanwhile, Miss Marple was paying what she called a comforting visit to her old friend Dolly Bantry. Though her purpose, truth be told, was not comfort but quiet observation. Mrs. Bantry sat on the edge of her armchair, her lace handkerchief crumpled in one hand. "It's perfectly horrid, Jane. I can't bear to think of that poor creature lying there in my library. The police have been in and out all morning, and Colonel Melchett from county headquarters is coming down himself. They even had the photographer from Much Benham. Imagine." "Yes, dear," said Miss Marple soothingly, her eyes glancing about the room. The library still bore faint traces of its grim discovery. A corner of the rug turned up, the scent of cleaning fluid lingering. "But you must admit, Dolly, it is rather a curious thing. A dead girl, unknown to anyone, found in such a respectable household." Mrs. Bantry gave a small groan. "They think we knew her. That's the dreadful part. I told Melchett I'd never seen her before in my life." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet she was placed here deliberately. That speaks of someone who wanted the connection made. A personal act, not random." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Jane, you sound positively police-like." "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple said with a mild smile. "I've just known a number of similar things in my time. People are very much the same everywhere, you know. Only their surroundings differ. I recall once at the vicarage fete, when Mrs. Bartlett accused the curate of stealing her jam money." Mrs. Bantry groaned. "Jane, I hardly think jam money compares with a corpse." "Ah, but it does," said Miss Marple gently. "Both began with vanity and ended with a lie." Outside, Inspector Craddock was questioning the household. The servants were anxious but firm in their denials. None had seen the young woman before. The cook mentioned that one of the maids, a timid girl named Elsie Holland, had fainted upon hearing the news, but she had been in the kitchen all morning. Colonel Bantry himself was indignant. "If anyone suggests I had anything to do with this nonsense, I'll demand an apology from the chief constable himself." Craddock scribbled something in his notebook. "No doubt, Colonel. But you do understand the position. A woman's body in your house, it doesn't look well. Dash it all, man. I tell you I've never set eyes on her." "Yes," said Craddock evenly. "So you've said." By afternoon, theories had multiplied. "She was a dancer from London," claimed Mrs. Price Ridley. They say she was seen near the Blue Boar Inn with a gentleman in tweeds." "Rubbish," said Miss Hartnell. "It's that young Dr. Hurst, mark my words. He's been behaving oddly for weeks, ever since that widow moved into the old rectory." At which Miss Weatherby added darkly, "They say the widow's husband died rather suddenly. You know, each tale was more elaborate than the last, until one of the butcher's boys breathlessly announced that the police had identified the dead girl's handbag, found hidden under a hedge near the railway station. It contained a theater program from London, a compact mirror, a few coins, and a calling card, Ruby Keene, the Majestic Hotel, Danemouth." When Miss Marple heard the news, she merely nodded. "Ah," she said softly, "Danemouth. Such a pretty place by the sea. I recall a friend of mine stayed at the Majestic once. They said it was rather smart, and quite full of interesting people." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Then we might find out who she was." "Oh, I dare say we shall," Miss Marple replied. "But the more interesting question, my dear, is not who she was, but why someone wanted her found here in St. Mary Mead, of all places." Her knitting needles clicked softly in her lap as she added, "Murder is seldom tidy, but it's rarely without reason." And though the police prepared to follow the trail to Danemouth, Miss Marple's mind remained fixed upon the people closer to home, on glances exchanged, stories slightly altered, and the curious tension that seemed to ripple through even the most respectable of households. Because she had seen it before, in different forms, in different lives. The quiet web of secrets that bound one human being to another, until someone decided to cut the thread. Inspector Craddock was not a man easily rattled, but even he felt that this particular case had something off about it. A dead girl from a seaside hotel turning up in the library of a retired colonel. Well, it wasn't the sort of thing one encountered in routine police work. By mid-morning, a small delegation from county headquarters had arrived. Colonel Melchett, broad of frame and brusque of manner, took command with the air of one who disliked mysteries on principle. "The facts are simple," he said grimly, spreading out his notes on the Bantry's dining table. "The girl's name was Ruby Keene, professional dancer, employed at the Majestic Hotel, Danemouth. She was reported missing 2 nights ago, and now she turns up dead here, miles away. It's absurd." Miss Marple, who had been quietly pouring tea for the gentleman, remarked mildly, "Absurd, perhaps, but human nature very seldom is." Melchett glanced up, frowning slightly. Miss Marple, isn't it?" Yes, I've heard of you. Clever old lady. Well, this isn't a matter for village intuition, I'm afraid." Miss Marple smiled as she set down the teapot. "Oh, of course not, Colonel. It's a police matter, naturally. Still, one can't help noticing certain similarities." "Similarities?" Craddock asked, intrigued despite himself. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "It reminds me of a case once in our parish council, when Mrs. Webb accused the secretary of stealing her bicycle. It turned out, you see, that she'd lent it to her niece and forgotten. The point being that Mrs. Webb wanted to believe someone else was responsible." "People often do," Melchett sighed. "We're not dealing with a bicycle, Miss Marple." "No," she agreed serenely. "We're dealing with guilt, which is very much the same thing." By the next day, the investigation had spread to Danemouth. Craddock's men returned with details that painted Ruby Keene as the sort of girl who attracted attention. She was young, pretty, ambitious, and calm, and not above flirting with wealthy guests. The Majestic's manager described her as lively, a bit of a coquette, but harmless. Several male guests remembered dancing with her. One older gentleman, a Mr. Conway Jefferson, had even taken something of a paternal interest in her, particularly after the death of his daughter. "She spent most of her evenings with Mr. Jefferson and his family," said the hotel clerk. "He's a widower, quite well off. Keeps a suite there for the season." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "And this Mr. Jefferson, how old would he be?" 60, perhaps. In a wheelchair. Lost both his wife and son-in-law in an accident some years back." Miss Marple, listening to the report from her armchair at the Bantry's home, murmured, "Ah, a rich, lonely man and a charming young girl. That combination, I fear, has caused trouble since the Garden of Eden." A telephone message came in from Danemouth that afternoon. Mr. Jefferson, on hearing of Ruby's death, was reportedly devastated. He claimed to have treated her like a daughter, even intended to leave her something substantial in his will. Mrs. Bantry looked startled. But surely, Jane, that would give someone else a motive, one of his relatives, perhaps. Indeed, said Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly. Jealousy is an old and sturdy weed, my dear. It grows best in families. That evening, Miss Marple invited Inspector Craddock to tea, a fact that the inspector later admitted was both unexpected and slightly intimidating. I wonder, she said, as she poured, if the poor girl was killed in Danemouth and brought here afterwards. Craddock frowned. That's what puzzles us. No car tracks, no sign of anyone entering the grounds that night. The servants heard nothing. Servants rarely do, said Miss Marple gently. One learns to look the other way, after all. But tell me, did you happen to notice her fingernails? He blinked. Her fingernails? They were painted, I think. Bright red? Yes, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Curious, isn't it? Ruby Keene was known to dance every night, but one of her fingernails was broken quite recently. Perhaps during a struggle, and yet her hands were otherwise immaculate. That suggests she had time and her help to make herself tidy again. Craddock stared. You think someone arranged her after she was dead? Perhaps, said Miss Marple softly. Or perhaps someone wanted her to look a certain way when she was found. Appearances are often used to tell lies, Inspector, especially by those who know how to play on them. The following morning brought fresh complications. Another body was found. This time it was a young woman discovered in a burnt-out car on a lane outside Danemouth. Her face was unrecognizable, but in her purse was a driving license belonging to Ruby Keene. Craddock swore softly when he read the report. Good Lord, 2 bodies, 1 name. What in blazes does that mean? Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, looked up from her knitting, eyes sharper than they had been since the whole affair began. It means, my dear Inspector, she said quietly, that somewhere in all this confusion, someone has told a very deliberate lie, and if we are to find out who killed Ruby Keene, or whoever that poor girl truly was, and we must first discover which death happened twice. The second discovery sent ripples of confusion through both St. Mary Mead and the Danemouth police. 2 bodies, both connected to Ruby Keene, and yet, impossibly, both could not be her. Inspector Craddock found himself staring at 2 photographs on his desk. The smiling, fair-haired girl from the Majestic Hotel, and the lifeless figure found in the Bantry's library. They looked similar enough at first glance, but something about the shape of the jaw, the hairline, the tilt of the chin was subtly wrong. Same general type, he muttered, but not the same girl. Colonel Melchett grunted. So who the devil is the one in the library, then? Someone meant to be Ruby Keene, or meant to seem like her, said Miss Marple quietly from her usual seat in the corner, her knitting clutched neatly in her lap. There's a difference, Colonel. Melchett gave her a look that said he wasn't entirely sure whether she was a help or a nuisance. You mean a deliberate substitution? I mean, said Miss Marple mildly, that people very often mistake the appearance of things for their substance, especially men. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You think the girl in the library was meant to impersonate Ruby Keene? I think, she said thoughtfully, that she may have been used. Perhaps not even knowing it herself. By now, the investigation had produced its first official suspect, Mr. Basil Blake, a young man of independent means and deplorable manners who lived on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, with a girl the village politely referred to as an actress. He was, by every social measure, the ideal target for suspicion. He had quarreled publicly with Colonel Bantry the week before about the use of a footpath. He drove a flashy red motor car, and he was known to keep late hours. Bound to be him, declared Mrs. Price Ridley with certainty. The type who listens to jazz and takes photographs of ladies in bathing costumes. Quite, said Miss Hartnell grimly. Degenerate sort. And what sort of name is Basil, anyway? So when Inspector Craddock, following an anonymous tip, found that Basil Blake had been seen driving into the village on the night of the murder, the conclusion seemed practically gift-wrapped, at least to everyone except Miss Marple. The inspector called on her that evening, weary and faintly irritated. We've got our man, Miss Marple. He admits he came through the village around midnight. Could easily have dropped the body at the Bantry's. He's been drinking heavily and his story keeps changing. Miss Marple listened, nodding, her needles clicking softly. And what reason does he give for his movements? Claims he was coming home from the Blue Boar Inn. Says he saw a light on in his cottage and thought someone had broken in. Ah, murmured Miss Marple. And did they find anyone? No. He says it was his girlfriend, the so-called actress, who'd come down early. But she swears she wasn't there until the next day. Miss Marple sighed gently. Yes, that sort of confusion happens when one tells lies without rehearsing them first. Still, I shouldn't think young Mr. Blake had anything to do with the murder. Craddock frowned. No, why not? My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple with mild reproach. Men who commit murder rarely behave untidily afterwards. Mr. Blake may be many things, rude, insolent, and possibly drunk. But he is not untidy. To leave a body in a respectable person's library? That is not a young man's crime. That is something rather more deliberate. Meanwhile, at the Majestic Hotel, inquiries were uncovering tangled relationships. Mr. Jefferson, the wealthy invalid, had indeed intended to alter his will, to include Ruby Keene as a beneficiary. His remaining relatives and his niece, Pamela Reeves, and his adopted son, Mark Gaskell, were less than pleased. She wasn't his type, said Mark Gaskell, a handsome man with cold eyes. She was ambitious, manipulative. She saw an opportunity and took it. I told my uncle she'd break his heart. Pamela, however, looked uneasy under questioning. Ruby was kind to me, she said quietly. But she did like attention. She said she'd soon be rich, did she? Said Craddock. How soon? She laughed when I asked. Said sooner than you think. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, the evening light falling softly on her silver hair. She watched the village street below, the postman stopping to chat with Miss Weatherby, the vicar's bicycle leaning outside the grocer's. Everyone, she murmured to herself, thinks the murderer must be extraordinary. But the extraordinary rarely bothers with deception. Only the ordinary do. The ordinary person, trying very hard not to appear so. Her eyes lingered on the copy of the Times lying on her table. A small notice about a motor accident near Danemouth, involving a car belonging to one Mr. George Bartlett, a guest of the Majestic. The car had been stolen the night of Ruby's disappearance. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. Ah, she whispered. So that's how she traveled. The next morning, Inspector Craddock arrived, exasperated. Miss Marple, the chief constable is convinced it's Basil Blake. There's pressure from above to make an arrest. Then do so by all means, she said sweetly, resuming her knitting. But it won't help you much. Why not? Because, Inspector, you've only caught the person the murderer wants you to catch. And until you see why the poor girl had to die twice and who benefited from that confusion, you'll never find the real culprit. She smiled then, that gentle, grandmotherly smile that concealed an intellect sharper than any blade. Now, she said, if I were you, I should start looking into wills, wardrobes, and women who say less than they mean. The following Sunday dawned with deceptive tranquility. The church bells of St. Mary Mead rang out across hedgerows and rooftops, calling the villagers to morning service, as though death and deceit had no place among hymnals and polished pews. Miss Marple, neat in her dove-gray coat and hat adorned with a modest blue ribbon, sat quietly near the front pew, her hymn book open but her mind elsewhere. She was thinking, as she so often did, about the details and small, seemingly trivial things that most people forgot. A pattern of mud on a hem, the tone of a voice when recalling a memory, or the peculiar way a person avoided answering a question. That morning, she found herself reflecting on Ruby Keene, or rather, on the girl who had been found in the Bantry's library. The papers now called her the unknown dancer, but Miss Marple doubted she had ever danced a step in her life. After service, she lingered near the churchyard gate, where gossip bloomed as freely as the ivy on the old stone walls. Mrs. Price Ridley was expounding loudly that the police had made an arrest. They hadn't. While Miss Hartnell maintained that Basil Blake had confessed everything, he most certainly hadn't. Miss Marple listened politely, murmuring her usual, "Dear me, how very shocking," until the conversation drifted, as gossip often does, toward clothing. She was wearing a white evening gown, wasn't she? Said Miss Weatherby. Very fashionable, they say. Covered in sequins. Yes, dreadful thing for daytime, sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley. I can't imagine how she came to be in it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, she said softly. It is odd, isn't it? One doesn't often travel far dressed for the ballroom. The women laughed, taking it for one of Miss Marple's harmless remarks. But her mind was already miles away, in the Bantry's library, picturing the dead girl's white gown glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Craddock at his temporary office in Much Benham. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, looking up from a pile of notes. "I do hope you're not here to tell me Basil Blake is innocent again. He's made himself look even worse. Apparently he burned something in his fireplace the night of the murder." "Yes, dear Inspector," said Miss Marple serenely. "He burned clothes." Craddock stared. "You knew?" "It was in the Gazette this morning," she said. "But what interests me is whose clothes they were." He frowned. "His girlfriend's, probably. Or that poor girl's, Ruby Keene's." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but which Ruby Keene?" She leaned forward slightly, her gentle voice threading through the silence of the office. "The girl found in the Bantry's library was wearing evening clothes, white satin, sequins, and dance shoes. Yet her fingernails were rough, her hair slightly uneven at the back, and her ankles bore the faint marks of heavy stockings recently removed. Hardly the toilette of a professional dancer." Craddock blinked. "You mean she was dressed to look like Ruby Keene?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and by someone who knew roughly what Ruby wore, but not well enough to notice that she always painted her toenails as well as her fingernails. Such vanity is rarely overlooked by a girl in that line of work." Craddock looked startled. "But who would have known those details?" "Someone at the Majestic," she said simply. "Someone close enough to Ruby to study her habits, and someone who needed her likeness for a few hours. Say, to impersonate her while Ruby herself was being disposed of." Craddock rubbed his temples. "So the body in the library is the imposter, a decoy. But who was she then?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "someone quite unimportant. A young woman without friends, a similar figure, a ready substitute, a chambermaid perhaps, a cousin, or even a girl from the village of Danemouth itself." Her eyes, bright beneath their gentle lashes, watched the inspector closely. "People like that disappear every day, Inspector. No one misses them, except perhaps a mother somewhere who receives no letters." That evening, as Miss Marple walked home through the twilight, her thoughts wandered once more to the people of St. Mary Mead, to Mrs. Bantry's nervous glances, to the way the Colonel's face had flushed when Ruby's name was first mentioned, to the peculiar fact that Basil Blake's girlfriend, a bold, theatrical young woman named Dinah, had abruptly left for London the day after the murder. Coincidences were rare, Miss Marple reflected. More often they were conveniences, and convenience was the murderer's closest ally. As she reached her gate, she paused, gazing at the sunset over the thatched roofs. "If one wished to make a girl vanish," she murmured to herself, "and yet be certain everyone believed they'd seen her after her death, one might use another girl's body. Yes, one might indeed." She smiled then faintly, as if greeting an old truth, because Miss Marple knew something the police did not. The dead rarely lied, but the living almost always did. The next few days brought no peace to either Danemouth or St. Mary Mead. The newspapers, predictably merciless, had christened it the library murder. Photographers loitered outside the Bantry's gate, and curious visitors came from neighboring villages just to stroll by the property and whisper. For the Bantrys, it was intolerable. For Miss Marple, it was informative. The more people talked, the more they revealed not about the crime, but about themselves. That Wednesday afternoon, she was invited for tea at the vicarage with Griselda Clement, who was, as usual, rather pleased to be in the thick of scandal. "I think it's deliciously shocking," she said, pouring tea with a flourish. "Don't you, Jane? A murdered girl and actress, a body in the library. I can't help thinking it's straight out of one of those dreadful thrillers." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I dare say it might seem so to you, dear. But murder is never quite so tidy as it is in books." Griselda leaned forward. "You really don't think that awful Basil Blake did it, do you?" "No," said Miss Marple simply. "Basil Blake is a fool, not a murderer. He knows how to shock people, but not how to deceive them." "Then who?" Griselda asked eagerly. "Someone from Danemouth?" Miss Marple hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the window where the churchyard lay in soft afternoon light. "Murder often begins far from where it ends, my dear. The seeds are sown long before anyone notices the weeds." That same evening, Inspector Craddock returned from Danemouth with fresh information. He looked tired, his collar slightly askew, his notebook filled with scrawls. "I think we're starting to see a picture, Miss Marple," he said. "Ruby Keene had a connection with the Jefferson family that was complicated." Miss Marple nodded. "Complicated relationships are rarely anything else, Inspector. Mr. Jefferson treated her like a daughter," Craddock continued. "But his nephew, Mark Gaskell, may have felt otherwise. One of the hotel maids says she saw him and Ruby quarreling outside the ballroom the night she disappeared." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what about Miss Pamela Reeves, the niece?" "She's gone missing," Craddock said grimly. "Missing. Went out for a walk yesterday morning and never came back. They found her handbag at the bus station." For the first time, Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-row. "My word," she said softly. "How very curious. The niece disappears just as her cousin's troubles deepen, and just when we've learned that another woman was dressed to impersonate Ruby Keene. It does make one wonder who precisely was meant to vanish, and who was meant to be found." That night, the majestic hotel in Dannemouth became the setting for a most uncomfortable gathering. Mr. Jefferson, pale and drawn in his wheelchair, received Inspector Craddock in the presence of Mark Gaskell, Pamela Reeves's mother, and several uneasy onlookers. "I cannot believe it," said Mr. Jefferson, voice trembling with emotion. "Pamela gone and Ruby murdered. Why? Why would anyone wish them harm?" Gaskell stood rigidly by the window, his hands in his pockets. "Perhaps, Uncle, because you were about to disinherit your family for a girl you barely knew." "Mark," cried Mrs. Reeves. "It's true," Gaskell snapped. "You were bewitched by that little adventuress. She'd have taken everything if she'd lived long enough." Miss Marple, sitting quietly near the door, raised her eyes from her knitting. "It's odd," she said softly, "how men always think it's the woman who ensnares them and not the other way round." Gaskell shot her a glare. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Oh, nothing, really," said Miss Marple mildly. "Only that I've often found men blame a woman's cunning for what was, in truth, their own foolishness." A small silence followed. Mr. Jefferson looked at her keenly. "You think I was foolish, Miss Marple?" "I think," she said gently, "that kindness can be very dangerous when it's mixed with guilt. You lost your daughter in an accident, didn't you? And your son-in-law?" "Yes." "And Ruby, she reminded you of your daughter, perhaps?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." "She did. Then you wished to make amends through her," Miss Marple said softly. "To give her what you felt you had denied your own. That kind of affection attracts envy, Mr. Jefferson. And envy is a motive far older than greed." Afterwards, as she walked back through the hotel corridor with Inspector Craddock, the detective gave her a sidelong look. "You've a way of saying the most unsettling things, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Truth is often unsettling, Inspector, but it does have the virtue of being consistent," he sighed. "So you think Mark Gaskell did it?" "Oh no," she said lightly. "He's much too obvious. He may be guilty of many things, selfishness, vanity, but not murder. At least, not yet," Craddock blinked. "Not yet? People change when they realize their lies are about to be found out," Miss Marple said and resumed her knitting. "Now tell me, Inspector, what did they say about Pamela Reeves's shoes?" He frowned. "Her shoes?" "Yes, dear. People always forget about shoes. They're the truest witnesses of all." When Craddock looked blank, Miss Marple only smiled. "Never mind," she said. "We shall see soon enough who has been walking in whose shoes, both figuratively and literally." That night, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple reviewed everything in her mind. Two young women, both resembling each other. One wealthy man with a guilty conscience, one missing niece, and a plan so convoluted it almost made sense. Almost. The clock chimed softly on the mantel. If the wrong girl was found in the library, Miss Marple murmured to herself, then the right girl must still be out there. Somewhere. And someone somewhere is waiting for the moment when no one will know the difference. Her needles clicked one final time. "Yes," she whispered. "It's beginning to make sense now." The morning broke gray and sullen over St. Mary Mead, as though the weather itself had grown weary of the whole dreadful business. The Bantry's house was mercifully quiet again. No reporters, no policemen, just Mrs. Bantry fretting over her roses and Colonel Bantry pretending to read the Times while sneaking glances at his wife's expression. Miss Marple, however, was not tending roses. She was at the vicarage, knitting and waiting for a telephone call she was quite certain would come. And it did. Inspector Craddock here, Miss Marple. We found her. Pamela Reeves. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Alive? No, ma'am, Craddock said quietly. Dead. In a burnt-out car at Chalk Heath, about 15 miles from Danemouth. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Oh dear, she murmured. That's very sad indeed, though I dare say it's also most enlightening. At Danemouth Police Station, Craddock met her an hour later. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and confusion. The car was a small Morris, he said, flipping through his notes. Registered in Pamela Reeves's name. Body badly burnt. Identification from dental records. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the map on the wall. And this was found after Ruby Keene's murder? 2 days after. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. And yet it must have happened before. Craddock looked puzzled. Before? My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple gently. You must remember that murderers, like tailors, do their work in sequence. The first crime is often tidy, the second always desperate. This, I think, was the desperate one. The discovery sent ripples through the village, and through the Jefferson household most of all. Mr. Jefferson was distraught, his sense of guilt deepening. 2 young girls, both dead, he murmured. Both connected to me. It feels like some sort of curse. Miss Marple, sitting quietly nearby, regarded him with sympathy. Not a curse, Mr. Jefferson, merely consequence, he frowned. Of what? Of too much kindness, perhaps, and too little suspicion. Mark Gaskell entered then, pale and agitated. They'll say this is connected to Ruby. They'll drag the family through the mud again. Miss Marple looked up at him. Truth has a tendency to do that, I'm afraid. It's most inconvenient. He turned sharply. You seem to think you know something, Miss Marple. Oh, not no, Mr. Gaskell, merely suspect. One must be careful with knowledge. It's dreadfully heavy to carry unless one is quite sure. That afternoon, the Bantrys received an unexpected visitor. A maid from the Majestic Hotel. A timid little thing named Gladys Trent. Her hands trembled as she accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry. It's about Miss Keene, ma'am, she said. And Mr. Gaskell. Miss Marple, who had been quietly darning a pair of gloves, did not look up. Gladys hesitated. The night before Miss Keene disappeared, I saw her crying in the corridor. Mr. Gaskell had been with her. He told me to forget what I'd seen. Mrs. Bantry gasped. You didn't tell the police? Gladys shook her head miserably. I was afraid, ma'am. But there's more. A few days before that, I found a pair of burnt gloves in the wastebasket in Mr. Gaskell's suite. Women's gloves. I thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple finally looked up. Burnt gloves? Yes, ma'am. Singed at the fingers as though they'd been too near a fire. The old lady's eyes brightened. My dear, she said softly, you've been far more observant than you realize. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, the small fire throwing gentle shadows across the room. She laid out her thoughts carefully as though arranging her knitting pattern. Ruby Keene, strangled, found in the Bantry's library, Pamela Reeves, burnt beyond recognition, in a car, both girls young, dark-haired, similar build, one intended to disappear, the other to be found. And then, the question that solved itself the moment she asked it, which girl was truly meant to die? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, she whispered. The murder happened twice, not because there were 2 deaths, but because the same murder was committed twice over, to make sure it appeared just once. The next day, Inspector Craddock arrived again, clearly rattled. There's been another development, Miss Marple. We've examined the burnt car. The ignition was tampered with. It was set to burn after being abandoned. And this is the odd part, there's a pair of dance shoes under the seat. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Silver? Yes, how did you... Oh, just a guess, she said with a faint smile. You see, Inspector, someone needed Ruby Keene's body to be identified as Pamela Reeves's. Until, of course, that became impossible. And so they reversed the plan. Pamela was made to look like Ruby. Ruby was dressed as Pamela. And when the fire took care of what remained, everyone was quite certain who was who. Craddock stared at her. Good Lord, but why all that trouble? Because, my dear Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, one of them stood to inherit a very great deal of money, and the other nothing at all. She leaned back, her voice soft and almost kind. It's an old story, really. A rich old man, a charming niece by marriage, and a young girl he might have favored instead. jealousy, fear of losing comfort, all wrapped in affection. The trick was simple. Make the wrong girl disappear and the right one seem dead. Craddock swallowed. Then you think Mark Gaskell? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Mark was merely a participant, not the planner. Then who? Miss Marple's expression grew distant. Someone who has learned how to play helplessness to perfection. Someone who has lived comfortably on deceit and calls it loyalty. I should like to speak to Mrs. Jefferson. That night, Miss Marple sat at her desk and wrote a single line in her notebook. The second murder was meant to erase the first, but instead it revealed the murderer's fear. She closed the book with a soft sigh. The game, she knew, was nearly at its end. But before she revealed the truth, she would have to let the murderer believe they had succeeded. Only then would the final test begin. The following morning dawned with the deceptive serenity of any ordinary village day. Milk delivered, post arriving, church bell chiming 8:30. But to Miss Marple it was the day the final mask would slip. She had arranged, with Inspector Craddock's reluctant approval, a casual gathering at the Jefferson Suite in the Majestic Hotel. Nothing formal. Of course, just a quiet talk with the principal figures, under the pretext of offering condolences and closure. But Miss Marple knew it was no ordinary visit. Today, she would draw the net tight without appearing to draw it at all. When she arrived, Mrs. Jefferson was already seated near the window, elegant in morning black, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. Mark Gaskell hovered by the fireplace, chain-smoking. Mr. Jefferson, pale and frail in his wheelchair, looked almost transparent. Inspector Craddock stood discreetly by the door, notebook in hand, though Miss Marple had advised him. No questions, dear. Only listening. Murderers reveal themselves not when accused, but when they think they're safe. The room was heavy with silence, until Miss Marple broke it with gentle conversation. You must forgive me for intruding, she said kindly, but I have always found that when tragedy strikes, talking things through quite calmly can sometimes bring a little peace. Mrs. Jefferson nodded tightly. You're very kind, Miss Marple, though I doubt any of us shall find peace until we understand why this happened. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Indeed, 2 girls dead, both so young, and all for reasons that began, I think, in kindness. That's the pity of it. Kindness can so easily turn to cruelty when it's misplaced. Mark Gaskell frowned. I'm not sure I follow. Oh, I dare say you do, Miss Marple said mildly. Your uncle's affection for Ruby Keene was quite genuine, wasn't it? Almost fatherly. And yet that affection threatened others. People don't like to lose security. They prefer to disguise resentment as concern. Mrs. Jefferson's fingers twitched around her handkerchief. Are you suggesting that anyone here resented Ruby Keene? Miss Marple's eyes were innocent. Oh, heavens, no. But human nature is very curious. For instance, when a man decides to change his will, those who benefit often find it distressing. There was a tiny pause. Then Mr. Jefferson spoke weakly. I did change my will. Ruby was to inherit a small sum, nothing more. It was only kindness. Ah, said Miss Marple softly. Then it was the idea of her inheriting that frightened someone, not the reality. People rarely kill for money they already have, but often for money they might lose. Craddock watched closely as Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and leaned forward slightly. Her voice remained gentle, conversational, yet every word seemed deliberate. I wonder, she said, if any of you have ever heard of a trick once used by a very clever criminal, someone who needed to kill one person but make it appear to be another? It involved 2 women, you see, who looked remarkably alike. Mark Gaskell's cigarette trembled slightly. Mrs. Jefferson's lips pressed together. One was made to vanish. The other was made to be found, Miss Marple continued calmly. A dreadful business. And all because the killer assumed that no one would notice small things, like the shoes being half a size too large, or the gloves burnt at the fingers. Miss Marple, said Mrs. Jefferson sharply, what exactly are you implying? Oh, merely thinking aloud, my dear. But it does make one wonder why Pamela Reeves's car was set ablaze after her death. Such trouble, you see, when the murderer could have left her body undiscovered. Unless, of course, it was necessary to prove she was someone else. Mr. Jefferson gave a faint gasp. Good Lord, are you saying Pamela wasn't the one in the car? Miss Marple looked at him kindly. No, Mr. Jefferson, the body in the car was Pamela Reeves. But the one found in the library, dressed as Pamela, was Ruby Keene. 2 deaths, 1 deception. The murder that happened twice. Mrs. Jefferson rose suddenly, pale as linen.
This is nonsense.
You can't possibly— Oh, but I can, said Miss Marple softly, her eyes steady. You see, Mrs. Jefferson, you are a very intelligent woman. You've lived long enough to know the comforts of wealth and the terror of losing it. When your husband's nephew married you, you gained a life of ease. When your father-in-law showed affection for another girl, that life was threatened. Lies. Miss Marple's tone didn't change. It was you who planned the exchange, wasn't it? Ruby would vanish, Pamela would play her part for a day or two, and then Pamela would disappear forever, her death staged. The police would believe Ruby had gone away, and when Mr. Jefferson's will was settled, there'd be no one to challenge your position. Mrs. Jefferson's eyes blazed. How dare you? But Ruby became suspicious, Miss Marple continued gently. She realized she was being used, so she had to die. And when Pamela tried to back out, she had to die too. A silence fell, thick and dreadful. Then very softly, Miss Marple said, "What gave you away, my dear, were your hands." My hands. Yes, when we met, you said you'd never seen Ruby dance. Yet your fingers had a burn mark, like someone who'd handled a glove too close to a fire. I thought at the time it was curious. Mrs. Jefferson's composure cracked. She glanced wildly toward the window, then toward Mark, then back at Miss Marple. "You old witch," she hissed. "You don't understand. Everything was for him." Mark recoiled. "For me?" But Miss Marple only sighed. "It's always for someone, my dear. Murderers rarely kill for themselves." An hour later, after Mrs. Jefferson had been taken away, Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple with a look of profound admiration. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "She never even confessed, yet you made it inevitable." "Oh, not I, Inspector," said Miss Marple modestly. "She confessed to herself the moment I said the word fire. She looked at her own hands. That's all it ever takes, really, showing people the truth they already fear. And all that talk about dancing shoes and gloves. How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, my dear, one cannot dance without practice. And Mrs. Jefferson never moved like a woman accustomed to watching from the sidelines." Craddock laughed softly. "You're remarkable." She shook her head. "Not remarkable, Inspector. Merely observant. One sees the same sorts of things in St. Mary Mead, only with smaller stakes. Jealousy over garden prizes or quarrels about who baked the best sponge. Human nature is much the same everywhere, only the consequences differ." That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a small cup of tea and sat by the fire. The clock ticked quietly. Outside, autumn leaves drifted against the window pane. She reflected on it all. 2 girls, 1 deception, and the vanity that had turned love into murder. "At last," she murmured to herself. "It's curious, isn't it? In the end, people never kill because of what they want. They kill because of what they fear to lose." And with that, she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the peace of St. Mary Mead, as though the world had righted itself again, at least for now. 2 days after the arrest, Inspector Craddock arrived once more at St. Mary Mead. He found Miss Marple in her garden, snipping dead blooms from her chrysanthemums with quiet satisfaction. She looked, as always, as if murder and mayhem were quite foreign to her peaceful existence. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat. "Thought you might like to know how things have settled." "I'm always interested in human nature, Inspector," she replied, smiling faintly. "And few things reveal it so thoroughly as the aftermath of a crime." He followed her into the sitting room, where tea was laid out and the air smelled faintly of lavender polish and wool. "She's confessed, you know," Craddock said after a moment. "Mrs. Jefferson? Not at first, but once she realized the game was up. Cleverest plan I've ever seen, really. 2 girls, switched identities, 2 murders meant to look like one." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Cleverness without conscience is a dreadful combination. It always unravels in the end." Craddock sat down opposite her, flipping open his notebook. "I'd like to go through it once more, if you don't mind. Just to be sure I've got every detail straight. You seem to see the pattern better than anyone." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "It's not so much pattern, Inspector, as familiarity. The same motives reappear endlessly: envy, greed, fear, pride. People think themselves unique, but they rarely are." She settled her teacup and began, almost as if telling a bedtime story. "It began," she said, When Mr. Jefferson, kind, elderly, and remorseful, took a fatherly interest in young Ruby Keene, the dancer. His family, particularly his daughter-in-law, Mrs. Jefferson, found that quite alarming. She had grown used to comfort, and her husband's death had not diminished her dependence on her father-in-law's generosity. When she realized that Mr. Jefferson might change his will in Ruby's favor, panic set in. And panic in selfish hearts quickly turns to malice. She needed to ensure Ruby Keene disappeared, but not in a way that would attract suspicion. So she conceived a most ingenious plan, to substitute another girl for Ruby, if only for a short while. Craddock nodded. Pamela Reeves, the niece of one of Jefferson's friends. Exactly, said Miss Marple. A modest, impressionable girl, easily tempted by the promise of a small adventure. Mrs. Jefferson convinced her to pose as Ruby for a few days, perhaps with the idea of faking an elopement later. But Pamela was too decent, and when she realized there was deception involved, she tried to back out. Unfortunately, she already knew too much, so she was lured away and killed. Her body was placed in her own car, dressed as Ruby Keene, and the car set alight. Meanwhile, Ruby herself was murdered and left in the Bantry's library, clothed in Pamela's simple dress to complete the illusion. 2 girls, 2 deaths, 1 supposed disappearance. The murderer thought it would appear that Ruby Keene had gone off and later perished in the fire. Craddock frowned thoughtfully. And the gloves? The shoes? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, yes. Such tiny things, and yet they spoke volumes. Pamela. Reeves was a size smaller in shoes than Ruby. The silver dancing slippers found under the seat of the burnt car didn't fit the charred body, proof enough that the body wasn't Ruby's. And the burnt gloves in Mrs. Jefferson's room. She tried to destroy evidence, not realizing the burns would incriminate her. She was thorough, though, Craddock said reluctantly. Nearly got away with it. Miss Marple's smile faded into a look of mild pity. Yes, but cleverness always overreaches itself. Her plan depended on everything remaining uncertain, on no one ever knowing which girl was which. But human beings are not interchangeable. Ruby's vanity, Pamela's innocence, those things cannot be disguised. I dare say even in death they left their mark. Craddock leaned back. And you saw all that from a pair of shoes and a few offhand remarks. Oh, I saw much more, said Miss Marple quietly. I saw fear. Mrs. Jefferson was a woman used to controlling appearances. When I spoke of kindness turning cruel, she flinched. When I mentioned wills, she looked at her husband's father instead of the floor. And when I referred to burnt gloves, she glanced at her own hands. Those were her confessions, Inspector, long before she uttered a word aloud. Craddock gave a low whistle. You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple chuckled softly. It usually is once you've seen enough of life. I've observed many crimes in St. Mary Mead, though of course they take gentler forms. Poisonous gossip, broken promises, a bit of petty deceit at the church fete. It's only a matter of degree. The motives are precisely the same. She picked up her knitting again, her fingers moving deftly. I often think, she went on, that murder is just the final stitch in a pattern begun long before. A little envy here, a little fear there, and one day, someone pulls too tightly on the thread. Craddock looked around the cozy sitting room, with its lace curtains and quiet, ticking clock. You know, Miss Marple, it's odd to think such things can be solved from a place like this. Oh, but this is precisely the place, Inspector, she said with a twinkle. People in villages notice everything. We may seem nosy, but observation is merely curiosity tempered with patience. And patience, I assure you, is the one quality murderers never possess. He smiled ruefully. Well, I'll be sure to remember that next time. Do, she said. It's the difference between catching a killer and missing your pudding. There was a brief pause as the old clock chimed 4. Craddock rose, tucking away his notebook. One last question, he said. Why do you suppose she said everything was for him? Who did she mean? Miss Marple's needles paused. Her late husband, I imagine. Or perhaps the idea of him, the life he represented. Some people mistake possession for love. When they lose one, they imagine they've lost the other. She resumed knitting with a small sigh. Poor woman. She killed 2 girls and destroyed herself, all to preserve an illusion. As Craddock left, Miss Marple walked him to the gate. The afternoon sun glimmered through the trees, and the sound of distant children's laughter floated over from the green. You know, he said thoughtfully, you've a way of making these terrible things seem almost understandable. Miss Marple smiled. Understanding isn't the same as forgiving, Inspector, but it does make the world less bewildering. She watched him walk away, then turned back toward her garden, where the last of the chrysanthemums glowed red and gold in the fading light. 2 girls, she murmured, 2 lives stolen by fear, and yet the village will bloom again. It always does. She bent to clip another flower. That's the mercy of human nature, I suppose. It grows back. 3 weeks had passed since the confession, and autumn had deepened over St. Mary Mead. The air carried the crisp scent of apples and bonfires, and the leaves lay thick along the lanes. Life, which had held its breath for so long, began to move once more with that gentle inevitability Miss Marple knew so well. At the Blue Boar, talk of the dreadful business at Gossington Hall had already begun to fade, replaced by gossip about the vicar's new curate and Mrs. Price Ridley's unfortunate choice of hat. The world, it seemed, was eager to forget murder, though not quite capable of forgetting Miss Marple's part in solving it. Mark my words, said Mrs. Hartnell one morning over tea. She knew it before the police did. Always does. That sweet, fluffy manner, don't be fooled by it. Miss Marple, seated a few tables away, smiled serenely and pretended not to hear. She returned home that afternoon to find a letter waiting by the hearth. The envelope was official, the handwriting bold and masculine. It was from Inspector Craddock. Dear Miss Marple, the case is concluded. Mrs. Jefferson will stand trial, though I doubt she'll see it through. She's a broken woman, and perhaps that's punishment enough. Colonel Melchett sends his regards, and the chief constable says he owes you more than one dinner. As for me, well, I can only say I'm grateful. You see things we professionals sometimes forget to look for. Yours sincerely, Dermot Craddock. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside her vase of flowers. Her eyes lingered on the letter a moment longer, and then she said softly, Poor man. He still thinks gratitude belongs where truth does. That evening, she sat knitting by the fire as shadows deepened across the room. Her mind wandered not to the murderer or the victims, but to something smaller, subtler, the fragile weave of human life itself. Ruby Keene, young and ambitious, had danced her way toward dreams of wealth and admiration, never realizing how dangerous envy could be when it wore a kind smile. Pamela Reeves, dutiful and good, had trusted too easily, believing the world to be fair because she herself was kind. Miss Marple sighed. Poor girls, so different and yet destroyed by the same thing, someone else's fear. The fire crackled softly. A photograph on the mantel caught her eye, her nephew Raymond smiling in some distant garden. He'd once called her the cleverest old lady in England, though she thought it rather an exaggeration. She did not feel clever now, only weary and a little sad. Murder, she murmured, always feels like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples reach farther than anyone expects. She thought of the Bantries who had opened their morning to find death in their library. The horror would fade, of course, it always did, but some part of that house would never quite feel safe again. And the villagers, for all their gossip, would tread more softly past Gossington Hall for many years to come. The next day brought a visit from young Cherry Baker, the maid from the hotel where Ruby had once danced. She was pale but determined, her hands clutching a small parcel. I just wanted to say thank you, Miss Marple, she stammered. If it weren't for you, no one would have believed poor Ruby wasn't what they said she was. Miss Marple smiled kindly. My dear, people are rarely what others say they are. They're usually what they try not to be. Cherry blinked, not quite understanding, but she smiled anyway. You're very wise, miss. Not wise, perhaps, said Miss Marple gently. Only observant. Wisdom comes from forgiveness, and I fear I haven't quite reached that yet. She pressed the parcel back toward Cherry. Keep it. Whatever it is, I think you'll have more use for it than I. Cherry curtsied and left, and Miss Marple watched her go with a small, wistful expression. Later that week, Colonel Melchett dropped by, gruff as ever but secretly fond of the elderly sleuth. Marple, you really must stop meddling in our affairs, he said. We can't have Scotland Yard depending on you every time someone commits a crime. I do try not to meddle, Colonel, she said, pouring tea. But murder has a way of finding me. One can hardly ignore it, you know. It's so very rude, he chuckled despite himself. Well, if you ever tire of gardening, we could use you at headquarters. Miss Marple looked genuinely horrified. Heavens, no. I should never survive the paperwork. As he left, she walked him to the gate. The evening light slanted golden across the hedgerows, and a blackbird sang somewhere beyond the lane. "Colonel," she said softly, "do you ever wonder why it happens? Why people kill?" He frowned. "Money, jealousy, rage. The usual lot." "Yes," she said, "but deeper than that. People kill when they believe the world owes them something. Love, respect, security. And when the world withholds it, they take it by force. That's what makes it so dreadful. It's always a form of longing." The colonel looked at her uneasily. "You sound almost sorry for them." "I am," she said simply. "Sorry for all of us. We stumble about wanting things we can't name, until one day someone trips and falls and the rest of us call it murder." That night after the village lamps were out, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, looking out at the dark garden. The wind stirred the trees and a few stray petals drifted across the lawn. Somewhere, far away, a church bell tolled 9. Miss Marple closed her knitting, smoothed her skirt, and smiled faintly. "Evil," she whispered, "never truly vanishes. But goodness endures in the small things. Tea poured kindly, flowers tended, a truth spoken softly. That's enough." She rose, drew the curtains, and with the quiet grace of one who has seen too much of both life and death, turned out the light. The village slept. The world went on.